Hello everyone, my name is Teresa and I'm pleased to bring you to this webinar about API risk management. Hope is not a strategy. We are pleased to be joined today with Luís Amorim. Luís has a large experience in sourcing and procurement. He started his career as a process chemist in a CMO, but soon moved to the purchasing department, where he was put in charge of strategic sourcing. Over about 10 years, he gained a solid understanding of the risks and also the challenges involved in the sourcing activity. And more recently, he moved to the pharmaceutical side of the business, where he is currently responsible for the outsourcing and strategic sourcing. If you have any technical problem or any other question, please send us a message in our Q&A. So, Luís, we are currently living in a historical moment that is causing disruption in the supply chain of medicines and APIs. How could companies have foreseen or been prepared for such an event?
Hi, Teresa. Thank you very much for the nice introduction and the invitation to join you in this webinar. So I hope by the end of this webinar, I will be able to share with everybody some experiences and hints and thoughts about the situation we are currently living. So COVID was definitely a lesson learning for everybody, and although a pandemic situation was always possible and therefore considered in the risk mitigation models, no one could ever imagine the impact of such an event that we are facing today. So the whole supply chain was highly affected with manufacturing sites being closed, so the employees being forbidden to go to work, airplanes grounded on the field. So we all saw those nice pictures of airplanes on the tarmac. So even though no one could consider this as a worst case scenario, and therefore still it was a low probability to occur, it will be in the end considered as a medium risk. When the crisis became a reality, the way we found to mitigate it as much as possible was to daily check the news. So go to the websites of the agencies and check the updates. Follow up with your suppliers. Talk to your providers. Anticipate the orders as much as you can. You could build the stocks. You could reschedule the production. So all those techniques you could use to mitigate as much as possible the current situation. It required a big flexibility on all levels. So people, production, logistics, contracts, but most of important, it was the commitment from the people. Across all players, and we saw the commitment and the willingness to keep business running as usual. Working sometimes in our conditions, so the workers were working with heavy protective measures, and mobility was highly reduced. But the business was kept on going and as much as possible without disruption.
As we are currently experiencing, there are still cases where companies are taken by surprise. Bearing this in mind, do you think that it is important for companies to do risk analysis and contingency plans?
Yes, sure, of course. So globalization and the pressure to look for more cost-effective means of supply have significantly increased the complexity of the supply chain, which makes it much more difficult to identify and understand the exposure to the risks. So if you can look at this, the graphic that we are showing to you, we can see how complex the supply chain can be with players and transactions happening all around the world. So to add to this complexity, the majority of players are located in completely different locations. So again, if we can see here on the map, we can see players being placed in completely different geographical areas. Therefore, more than ever, we need to have a strategy to ensure that we are prepared to face any worst-case scenario and adjust the risks constantly to detect potential threats on time. There are risks that commonly we can accept and for which we can be more or less prepared. But what worries me more are the ones difficult to predict and unlikely to happen. But when they happen, we are not enough prepared.
Like the one we are experiencing now.
Exactly, like the one we are experiencing at this moment, which is a very good example of this situation.
Besides COVID, can you give us real examples where contingency plans are needed and can be applied?
The current situation we are living in China due to the environmental regulations, it's a good example to show why it is so important to have contingency plans in place. So in this slide, we are presenting to you we can show you some of these cases that we are facing today in China. So these policies are causing API prices increase and API shortages. In 2017, just in Zhejiang province, more than 1,800 small manufacturers of chemicals and pharmaceuticals had been shut down due to this policy. Also, in April 2019, a big explosion happened in a plant located in Jiangsu province. After that, the government had closed 30 out of 89 producers of hazardous chemicals. Also, the numbers of chemical producers in this province is expected to decrease to the half of the next 2 years. Climate changes and natural disasters are other things that companies more and more need to be prepared for. This can affect the production of APIs and substances. So the heavy rains or the monsoons can also affect the manufacturing schedule or the shipment of the goods by those areas being affected by those phenomena. Tornadoes or very adverse climate phenomena are also affecting the different places in the world. On the other side, very dry conditions can also lead to massive fires that can as well affect in the same way the supply chain of our goods. So on the slide number 4 that we are sharing here with you, we are presenting some numbers of those catastrophes. So the number of natural catastrophes has been increasing through the years, as we can see on the graphic. So for 2004 till 2018, the number of relevant events of natural catastrophes by peril more than doubled. On the slide number 5, so we are presenting here some cases. 3 out of 5 of the world's biggest natural catastrophes by losses in 2019 happened in China or in India. Those are the countries where the majority of the APIs or the chemicals are located. On the different slide, we can show you another example of risks and the tensions like the recent exchanges between China and USA, or if you can see as well, Japan and Korea, resulted not only in an increased prices, but also taxes and import restrictions between the different countries. These should be other risks that can be applied in your contingency plan.
Thank you for sharing such an interesting example. This allows us to visualize lots of possible risks that our supply chain can be impacted with, and also to understand the importance of contingency plans. If we don't have a contingency plan in place, what can be the consequences to a company?
Thank you, Teresa. So I'm glad that I could make you visualize some of the possible risks that we are facing today in our companies. So there can be multiple consequences for your company, such as customers' complaints. You can have stockouts, you can have damaged inventory, you can delay your launches if you are in that situation. You can lose your reputation in the market or in the patients or the doctors. And you can also face penalties or fees in case you don't fulfill contracts due to those delays. From the company perspective, in my opinion, the worst thing that can happen is to lose your reputation. It is very difficult for you to build up a reputation, but it's very easy to lose it. And once you lose it, it's difficult to get it back. Customers and the patients, they trust you, and this has a high impact in the long term as it is difficult to regain confidence. Still, we are in a business where the ultimate goal is the patients. Either we supply a life-saving treatment or we improve the quality of life in a chronic disease. The major consequences is the patient being affected. This being said, we cannot just focus on the consequences for the company, but also to the end user, which is the patients.
True. To make sure that our company doesn't suffer these consequences, can you please explain how we initiate a risk analysis?
Sure. I will start with mapping the whole process that we are assessing. So this should start with your suppliers, the suppliers of your suppliers. Sometimes we forget to assess the suppliers of our suppliers, and also the distribution, the shipment, the storage, and the end user. After this, I will start identifying the risks. During this stage, you should think about the things in your supply chain that makes you vulnerable and all the things that might go wrong, right? So after identifying the risks, you need to assess them in terms of severity, probability of occurrence, and proximity. So finally, you should be able to respond to those risks. Since it is very difficult, most likely not probably, you can address all those risks identified. We should be aware of the priorities and which risks you can accept and the ones you cannot live with, right? So In this stage, an action plan with proper timelines and milestones should be prepared in order to measure the progresses of the risk mitigation and make sure they are properly managed or mitigated, right?
Thank you for sharing this process. Still, I'm not sure how we can do this. Can you please go deeper in each of the stages? Also, how can I prioritize my risks? I mean, how can I know which risk should I address first?
Absolutely. So, as I said, you start by developing an end-to-end supply chain map. So this enables potential risk areas to be easily identified as you can visualize what you have and where you are vulnerable, right? So it also helps you to better understand how products move in between, the flow of the inventory, your transition points, and how a lack of continuity between suppliers can introduce higher risk to you. Then you should start gathering information about the supply chain. Each supplier and their locations, the process, the operations, the API, how it moves between different locations, and what the lead times are in this world scenario. So then you initiate the identification stage. Here you should determine what might go wrong in the whole life cycle of the API. So while looking into the map that you prepare, you start making questions about your own API. So how complex is the API to be manufactured? How many manufacturers are there available in the market? Is this a niche product or is it a commodity? Is the process adequately defined and understood? Are the controls in place to meet the requirements of GMP and ICH guidelines? Then you start making questions about each supplier. Is the supplier also the manufacturer? And if not, do you know who the real manufacturer is? Sometimes we forget to understand the whole supply chain and we just focus on the supplier, but we also need to understand who the manufacturer is. So this is a very important question because if there is an increase in the demand, they can shortage your volume of API, so they can use it for their own benefit. Then is the manufacturing side in compliance with all legal, HSE and quality requirements? What is the power of the manufacturer? Is my demand relevant? Does the manufacturer have cross-contamination control precautions in place? This is relevant for the multi-purpose plants because you need to have those controls in place. So then also those my sources have dual sourcing strategy for the key raw materials. Where are my suppliers located? Do my technical agreements clearly define the roles and the responsibilities of each party? Have my suppliers built a risk mitigation plan? So then question yourself about how materials move between locations and the different manufacturers. So does the packaging, the storage, the distribution fit my API? How many handoffs do I have? What is the mode and the route of transport? What is the interim storage in different hubs or ports? So are we talking about days? Are we talking about weeks? And in which conditions? So you can have airports of very high temperature, or you can have a ship crossing the Ecuador. Also, does the manufacturer use subcontractors to ship the products? Are the subcontractors properly qualified? Is my API controlled in terms of temperature? Is this properly monitored? Temperature and humidity variations can impact heavily the API. So we also need to consider this. And finally, calculate lead times. How much time does it have to move between each point? How much time does it take to move from the beginning to the end? Is there any risk like long holding times due to customs clearance, local regulations, or exposure to high temperatures or rain? For instance, we talked about the monsoons before. Is this a campaign product or is the API producing all along the year? Once I identify all my risks and I have my full supply chain map, I need to quantify them. And for this, you want to look at your probability. What are the chances of this to happen? Are you in a high risk zone, like those political conflicts or the weather events that we talked before? Do you face extended lead times or long transition times between end to end? What impact will this have in your business? What are the consequences? How long will your business take from a loss in this area? It is a single source. And then when is it likely to happen? This links to the next concept, which is the proximity. is this a one-time event? Is there a season? So basically, how soon do you need to address this risk? So you should gather as much as information as you can so that you can accurately estimate the probability of an event to occur and with the associated impact and the proximity. Then you start assigning the values from, for instance, 1 to 4 to the probability and the severity of the occurrence. I choose 1 to 4, but it's up to you to choose a different scale. And to give you an example, a risk that is highly likely to occur has a very low probability, so we should score it like 1. So account should also be taken of what consequences will be if the risk did become reality. If the consequences are severe, then this will be assigned with a high severity score, and we can give it, for instance, 4. For each identified risk, the probability and the severity are multiplied to give you a final risk score, with 1 being the lowest and the 16 the highest score. We normally use variants like reputation, the cost, time recover to quantify the severity. So once we have the risk score, we define the risk proximity. When is the event likely to happen? A risk that is likely to happen soon, we should give a score of 4 because we need to address it right now. Then you put all together in a chart. In our slide that we are presenting, we have a chart where in the x-axis we have the risk score, the severity multiplied by the probability, and the y-axis we have the proximity. Each quadrant represents different priorities. So the risks that we are identifying as an apocalypse quadrant are the ones that you need to address right now. Those are the events that are likely to happen right now and represent high risk. COVID and the nitrosamines are an example of the apocalypse risk. The risks that are in the what we call troubled quadrant are our second priorities. Even though the events will only happen in a medium long term, they might result in a big negative impact for you if they happen. Monsoons are a good example of a trouble risk. If we look at the recent flooding situation in China, it resulted alone so far in more than 220 people dead or missing, and a direct economic loss of 179 billion RMBs, about 20 billion euros. Not to talk about India and other southern eastern Asia countries, where most of the suppliers of APIs and chemicals are located. So if my key suppliers of a specific API is located in China, and namely in the Yangtze draining basin, the probability of a monsoon to occur is very high, right? So also, if a monsoon happens, the severity is high, as you might not be able to ship or extract your API from that region. We might be planning today for delivery during the next summer from China, and which actually is when the monsoons are during the summertime. And so the proximity-wise, this risk is a distant future, but there's a probability that it will happen. The alert risks are our third priority. The event is happening now, but the risk is very low. Some alert risks might have been the evolution or in terms of time of the tracking risks. Like a computer software failure that is happening now, it's an example of an alert risk. So just because the likelihood it's very low and the severity is also very low. Finally, the tracking risks are the risks with a very low priority. And these events will only happen in a distant future, and the risk score is therefore very low. If there are any acceptable risks, they will probably be the ones in this quadrant. So an example, if I can give an example of a tracking risk, can be an equipment failure in the production. So imagine that the equipment is not used in the production of an API that will only be produced in 1 year. So the proximity is in a distant future. The probability of this equipment to failure is, we can assign 2, meaning that is more or less likely to happen, but when it happens, the consequences are not big, so the severity will be 1. As we move into time, the risks tend to move between quadrants. And this happens because we have two variants that are correlated with the time of the event, which is the proximity and the probability. A risk that is going to happen only in the distant future is currently happening now. Also, a risk that has low probability to occur. As soon as it happens, the likelihood increases to the maximum. A good example of this is COVID. So a pandemic situation will probably be considering a tracking risk because even though the severity will be 4, the maximum, the likelihood will be 1, as a pandemic situation is very rare and unlikely to happen. This gives us a risk score of 4, and the proximity will be 1 because the event will only happen in a very distant future if we can project on time. But as soon as the virus appeared in China, the probability immediately increased, and the risk that would only probably happen in a distant future is currently happening now, right now. So meaning that the COVID risk moves from the tracking quadrant, the one that we consider as less priority, to the apocalypse one, which we consider the higher priority in terms of risk.
There is a lot of things that you need to consider. How do you become an expert in every single area?
Well, Teresa, you don't have necessarily to become an expert in every single area. If at the end of the day you are still having troubles identifying your risks, then you should really engage with your teams and your partners and talk to them about what their risks are. You also should investigate your historical data that you might have, or even look at the key performance indicators you might have for your partners. Still, if you are yet not sure, you should consider to invest some budget in a consultant that will help you in this assessment that you need to perform internally. So this can save you a lot of money or eventually the whole business.
So now that we have a risk register, what do we do with it? How do we deal with the risks we have just identified before?
So during this phase, you will decide the activities that will result in action. This will, like the risk reduction, those which result in justifying action, which is the risk acceptance, or drop the activity, which is the risks unbearable. So the actions can lead you to sharing the risk, to transfer, or to reduce the risks. Transfer and share risks are the ones that require partnerships and that allows you to share or transfer the risks with the other teams, organizations, or third parties. For this to be possible, both you and your partner must share the same goal, of course. So, for example, when you can share a risk when you're partnered with another organization in a joint product development initiative, or you transfer part of it when some of the impact of the risk is also transferred. Insurance is a very good example of transferring the risk. Then if you regard reducing the risk, you can take actions to reduce the probability or the severity of the risk. To reduce the probability of receiving an API that does not meet the specification, the organization may, for example, increase the level of testing and the number of inspections in order to mitigate the risks until there is an assurance of the supply capability. To reduce the impact of a shortage of an API, you can qualify for it's a second source of API. Accepting the risk is when you make a conscious decision to accept the risk. This could be because the expenses involved are more than the cost of tolerating that risk, or you may not be able to do anything about the risk itself, but you can track and come up with a contingency plan to cope with its consequences. As an example, we can, for instance, consider challenges from a legal point, or commercial uncertainties. Geopolitical tensions are also a good example of these risks. When you unbear a risk, you make a conscious decision to don't go ahead with the process or the activity that carries that risk. This could mean not getting involved in a business venture, passing on a project, or skipping high-risk activity because this brings no advantage to your organization. Or also when the cost of addressing the effects is not worthwhile.
The goal of this phase should be to have all the risks below the acceptable level, correct?
Absolutely, of course.
Okay. How do we know the amount of effort that we need to put in a risk to reduce it? And also, why do we resist the acceptable risks if at the end we are not doing any action?
So the amount of effort used to mitigate the risk should be proportional to the significance of the risk, meaning to its score risk. A serious high risk requires a decisive, timely, and effective action. Sometimes you don't have an option to do much about your risk, but still, it is good to bring it up and be aware of it. Being aware of it and register all your risks at least enables an organization to monitor the situation and to be able to respond in an appropriate way if the situation changes. So you keep tracking of your own risks.
That makes sense. And what about the subcontracts? How do they fit in a risk analysis? Who bears the risk?
So there is the ICH Q7 guidelines, which actually refers to the outsourced GMP-related activities, states that the pharmaceutical quality systems of a contract giver should include the control and review of any outsourced activities. The contract giver is ultimately responsible to ensure the processes are in place to assure the control of the outsourced activities. These processes should incorporate quality risk management principles, and then the document goes on. If you look at the quality guidelines, namely the ISO 9001, they are not only aligned with the ICH guidelines, but further states the outsourced processes do not absolve the organization on the responsibility of conformity to all customer, statutory, and regulatory requirements. Bearing this in mind, companies should have a process in place to approve the subcontractors. Also, your quality team should be engaged in the processes and do an assessment to ensure the control over such a process. Because the subcontractor is responsible, but you are also responsible, so both of you bear the same risk.
Mm-hmm. Do you have some recommendations that would make our supply chain less vulnerable and more flexible?
Sure, yes. In a VUCA environment as we are living today, having a fast responding, agile and adaptive supply chain is becoming paramount. In that sense, the flexibility in the supply chain is becoming increasingly important, helping companies to most effectively manage their stocks, the resources and their costs. Flexibility is demand-driven as they are correlated. The lower the demand means that it's more difficult to find suppliers, so you should bring more flexibility into the supply chain. The traditional models of looking to the past to predict the future are no longer applicable. Today's markets are increasingly volatile, and a flexible supply chain can help companies to pull through potential damaging market changes such as shortages, disruptions, surge in the price, drops in the demand, or eventually unexpected requests. As a rule of thumb, I will say we need to be proactive, not reactive, and there are different ways to do it. So you could consider to qualify multiple sources in different locations. This can reduce, of course, your leverage power by diluting the business across different players, but at the same time can promote the competition between your suppliers. You can keep safety stocks to reduce the probability of inventory shortage. You can make sure that you add safety lead times to the actual cycle time. You can reduce the lead times by redesigning the whole process of procurement. You can change supplier or the way you select your suppliers from a cost focus to a speed focus, or developing suppliers for better lead times and management. So you can also negotiate your supply contracts to alleviate the minimum order quantities, or to obtain a commitment from suppliers to supply materials or service in the case of a significant increase in your demand. You could also identify alternative routing to ship your goods. You can also foster a strategic partnership with your key supplier partners, so you can share your forecasts and consolidate your list of suppliers.
How do we build a flexible global transportation network?
So having a diversified but global network should help in preventing transportation issues. Some countries, they have local and specific legislations or restrictions, and providers should be able to manage those. Qualifying multiple providers yourself or through a partner will help you to cover all scenarios as much as possible. So no single transportation provider is strong in every region. To ensure that you are choosing the best partner in a specific region, you should track the carry performance and, of course, the price.
Thank you, Luis, and thank you for your attention. So with that, we'll conclude and wrap up. I would say that, in summary, by creating a network of options and by having a flexible, agile, and adaptive supply chain, you'll have a safety net that will protect you and your clients. And the first thing that we recommend you to do, again, is to map your supply chain, map it out, look at the different players and locations, consider which API you're talking about, and take attention to your transaction points and lead times. Also, check your vulnerabilities. Then, after you have identified your risks, of course, you can deal with everything at once. So you need to assess your risks. And Luis made a great job showing you that matrix with a chart where it shows the risk score, the probability multiplied by the severity, and the proximity. And with that, you know which risks you need to assess first and which risks you can go after later on. And finally, how can you respond? You can decide to reduce, accept, or not to bear the risk. If you decide to reduce the risk by strategizing to build flexibility in, you can do that by qualifying multiple sources in different locations, keeping safety stock in the most flexible locations, adding safety lead times to the actual cycle time, or even reducing lead times by redesigning procurement process, for example. You can also negotiate supply contracts to alleviate minimum order quantities, for example, or identify alternative routings or shipment modes, and even have a global network of transportation providers in place. I think this is all. I will conclude the webinar with this expression: not identifying risks is risking everything. So again, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time and attention. And thank you, Luis, for accepting the invite.
Sure.
It was really, really good to have you here.
Thank you.